الله أكبر الله أكبر.
Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the Islamic Center at New York University podcast, coming to you straight from the heart of New York City. We're building an amazing Muslim community here at ICNYU where everyone is welcomed and respected no matter where you're from or where you're at. This is the place to be. So open your ears and your heart and come along with us on another life-changing journey. Bismillah.
Bismillah, alhamdulillah. Wassalatu wassalam ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. So last week, if you guys remember, we introduced the topic of just focus and mindfulness in prayer. It was called khushu', right? We were talking about some of the inner aspects of prayer outside of the kind of outward aspects, the mechanics of it. And today there'll be a few things that we'll do. We'll continue on with that. Talking about kind of the language elements of the first chapter, Surah Fatiha, which if you remember when we were breaking down like the obligatory parts to prayer, the necessary parts, and the recommended parts, in the obligations in the Hanafi school for prayer, you just have to recite some part of the Quran in the shortest form of the verse, right? Thumma nadhar is the shortest verse in the Quran. In Arabic, you would recite that, and that suffices if, you're learning how to pray, whether you're a new Muslim, you're new to prayer, even if you were born into it, you're kind of rebuilding a relationship. But in that necessary column, the second column of Acts, was recitation of this first chapter of the Quran, Surah Fatiha. And what we wanted to do was familiarize, with the meaning of the words as you're kind of memorizing it also. Does anybody remember the words we talked about last time? It was 2 weeks ago. Sorry we canceled last week. The sky turned yellow, and we felt like it probably was a good day for people to stay home instead of being out in the yellow sky. My son and I went bowling the night before on Tuesday, and my daughter is in 5th grade, but she did her first overnight trip in school. They took them to some place in the Poconos, and my son and I, because he was now at home alone, and I don't know if he's ever actually been away from his sister, for a night. My wife very sparingly has traveled, and I've been with the kids. I travel quite often to speak at different things. I'm like, you can come in. But the two of them have never been away from each other, my daughter and my son. So my son kept saying, I just wish, he calls his big sister Didi. That's how you say big sister in Hindi. So he's like, I wish Didi was here. So we went bowling, and then we went to this arcade, and we got food. And then when we came out, the world just smelled like it was on fire. We had no idea what was going on because we were just in this, playland for the 3 or 4 hours when all of it was happening. It was crazy. And then the next day, I went up to Columbia for something, and when I left the building, everything was just this orange-yellow haze, do you know? So we figured it might just be better to not have the class, just in case people, respiratory issues, asthmatic, anything like that. So we're picking up now 2 weeks later, so it's okay if there's kind of a drop, but do people remember what part of that chapter we talked about last time? Yeah. Yeah, so and then we went just through those first 2 words, right? Alhamdulillahi, right? It's technically 3 words, but what did that mean? Does anybody remember?
Praise and thanks.
Yeah, praise and thanks, and yeah.
Oh no, I was just going to point out the irony of the fact that I spent so much time staring at the Arabic and I never stopped to read what the words meant.
That's okay. Great. Did you learn the Arabic?
Alhamdulillah.
Yeah, amazing,
But
right?
I couldn't remember what it meant.
That's all right. You don't have to. Yeah. It's a different language. And you're just going to go through it piece by piece.
I just think it emphasizes the point of, like, you can be so used to saying something or just focus on, like, you can forget the meaning behind it.
Yeah. And there's a value to both, right? So it's not a both and in the sense that one is necessary for the other. In the prayer, the necessity is just the recitation of it, you know? So the recitation to it is what you're doing in the prayer. What we want to do to be able to deepen the inward part to the prayer, right? Just not a prayer of the body, but a prayer of the heart, and to have focus and mindfulness. If you remember 2 weeks ago, I asked you, why are you able to be attentive, theoretically, even in this mode of communication? Was because you can understand the words that are coming out of my mouth, right? If I was speaking a language that you didn't understand, I don't know what a language is that all of us, don't understand, any one of us, right? But let's say theoretically, no one in this room knew how to speak like Spanish, right? Likely some of you do know how to speak Spanish in some capacity or fluently. Let's assume no one does. And I was just up here talking to you in Spanish. You would fundamentally, after a bit, just zone out because all you have is sounds, right? Sounds in and of itself are a really important part of the Quranic kind of paradigm, and we get impacted by sounds constantly. I took my kids to a basketball game, and it was when Kyrie Irving came back to play for the Nets for the first time, if anybody follows basketball, right? And we didn't know, right? And the tickets went from like $20 a ticket all of a sudden to like $1,000 a ticket. And I thought it was an empty arena, and we got there, it was fully packed. And my son was like, Baba, you said no one was going to be here. And it was crazy. And then Kyrie walked down the court, and everybody went, whatever, hey, assalamu alaikum. And so if you've ever been to a basketball game or any type of sporting game, in between every 10, 20 seconds, it's just like loud sound, music, like announcers making all kinds of announcements. They're shooting T-shirts out of like these air guns, right? My son is sitting next to me, and at that point he was probably 6. He's now 7, and he's like moving in every which way. And I was like, Kareem, I didn't know you're such a good dancer. And as he's like moving around, he's like, Baba, I'm not dancing, right? But he's literally being impacted by the sound. Do you get what I mean? It's going in. He doesn't have to consciously consume it, but the consumption is still having an impact on him in some capacity. Right? So sound in and of itself is not something to undermine. There can be a gain to that. And there's a lot of people who they hear the recitation of the Quran, they don't know the meaning of the words, but the words, when they're engaging it through all of their organs of sensory perception, it just can hit a little bit different. But at some level, we want to not experience what people could experience when there is that language barrier. And to get to kind of the depth where some of the nuance gets lost in translation. And what we're going to talk about today can give us a little bit of that, because we're not necessarily using these words when we talk in English, right? So last time we broke down Alhamdu Lillahi, right? And we kind of talked about what do these words mean, what's really going on here. And today, we're going to talk about the second part to that first verse, that is Rabb bil Alameen. And when we pronounce it, we'll go through some more letters today to kind of make a distinction. Does anybody have the first chapter open, the translation? Yeah. What does it say? Just that verse.
All time and perfect and true praise belongs to Allah alone, the Lord of all the worlds.
Right. So this quite often gets translated as Lord of all the worlds. Arabic has like dictionaries the way English has dictionaries. So when you think of a Lord, which is quite often not a word that we utilize in English, right? Like there's not this kind of understanding in terms of our day-to-day jargon where we're using a word like this, right? When was the last time you said the word Lord to somebody? It's very antiquated. But also, if it was to evoke meaning for you, hey, it's not like, whoa, what are you doing here? This is Zayd. Zayd and I lived together about 18 years ago. Yeah, he used to let his relatives wear my clothes without telling me. It's amazing. Yeah, I know. Everyone knows now. Yeah, great. So we are not using words like this. It's antiquated language, but it also doesn't evoke the nuance of the meaning. There's so much more that's going on here when we are talking about this word. In Islam, this word denotes the foundational relationship between God and God's creation, right? Like there's certain relationships that we have in our life that assume that there is some type of partner in that relationship. You know, I can't be a husband without a wife. I can't be a father without a child. Do you know what I mean? Right? I can be like, an eater, right? There doesn't have to be another person involved. You get what I'm saying? Right? You can swim by yourself. Do you know? There's certain things you can do uniquely alone, and when you're given that title, there's not something that's a counterpart in the relationship that's automatically assumed, right? But if I tell you I'm a father, you might not know if I have a son or a daughter, but you know that I have a kid. Does it make sense? Right? If I'm a teacher, then I must have students, right? You know, if I'm an employer, it assumes that I have people working for me. This word Rabb in Arabic, that we're going to talk about its meaning in a bit, it has also a connection to a relationship that is pretty much the foundational understanding of how creation relates to God within an Islamic paradigm, because the word Rabb assumes a relationship to what is called an abd. The way a teacher has a student, the way a father has a child, a mother has a child, right? And you've probably heard words like, or names like Abdullah, right? Abdurrahman, right? Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, you know? So that's connected to this word. An abd is essentially translated as like a servant, but its base definition is it needs something, relies on something to exist. And God, uniquely within Islamic theology, is self-sufficient. Like, Allah does not require or rely upon anything for his existence. So everything in creation is an abd because everything relies on something to exist. But for the purposes of this conversation, in this verse, when we call upon God as Rabb al-Alameen, we're also creating now the filler to this gap that says, by logical principles, the same way you can assume if I say I'm a parent that I have a child, that the word Rabb gives an insight that there is Abd, which is me and you. Is everybody staying with me so far? Does that make sense? Right? So now I want to know, what am I actually an Abd of? Right? Because what we said in Fatiha, the first chapter, there's a reason why we're reciting this 17 times a day in our prayers. It's not just about the mechanics of it. And in the Hanafi school, it fits in that second bucket, the necessary acts. So you can pray in the Hanafi school without reciting this, but we want to learn it and memorize it so that we're growing at a pace with our relationship to the prayer, right? So if I'm going to be a servant of this, Rabb, Lord, I want to be able to know like what that means. So if you open up an Arabic language dictionary, it's going to tell you the word Rabb, and then there's a definition, right? Like if you looked up the word chair, it's not going to say chair in the dictionary, right? It'll say the apparatus that you can sit on, etc., etc. I don't know what the definition of chair is, clearly, right? Noun, right? You know? So this is going to define for us what is Rabb mean. It's going to be so much more than just Lord, right? Which is a word that we don't use. And it's connected to this. Alhamdulillah, that all praise and thanks, not just praise and not just thanks, right? But all praise and all thanks is uniquely for Allah. Rabbil Alameen, God is still introducing you to himself. He's saying, hey, this is me. The way when you all sat down in the beginning and I said, turn and tell people your names and how your day went. You know, my name is Khalid. I am a chaplain, etc., etc. Right? I'm giving you insight as to who I am. You are being told by the divine in this first chapter, like this is how he wants you to know who he is. Right? So the word Rabb, they'd say Rabb firstly denotes al-Malik. Sorry, my hands are... That he is the owner of everything. So this is foundational theology in Islam, that everything that exists is owned by God. But when you're calling God as Rabb, you're saying that he's the owner of it all, the possessor of it all, right? Everything that's given to you is given not because you deserve it, right? I don't have it, and by virtue of me having it means I deserve it and I'm entitled to it. That just because I want it doesn't mean that I need it. But what's given to me, I understand as a gift. Something that is owned by Al-Malik, the Rabb. If you're the owner of something, it doesn't necessarily mean that you are the one that decides how you can use those things, nor does it assume that you care for those things, right? Like, I could own this chair, I could own this laptop, and as the owner of the laptop, I could put it in a nice case, I could put it in a closet, I could lock the door, I could also just leave it on the ground, and my kids could step on it. I could throw it against the wall. The fact that I own something doesn't give other insight other than I simply own it. Do you get what I mean? Does that make sense? Like, you could own something and care for it. You could own something and you could treat it like garbage. You could own something and you could honor it. You could own something and you might not even be the one that decides how it gets used. You come to my house and I am the 40-year-old father in the house. And I walk into my house, my kids decide what's watching on TV. They didn't buy the TV. I bought the TV, right? But who's deciding what's being watched? So being in a place where you own it doesn't also necessarily mean that you're the one that's deciding like how it's utilized. Do you get what I mean? Like, we don't own this room right now, right? We don't own the building. NYU owns this building, right? But no one's in here saying you're allowed to do this or allowed to do that. Does that make sense? So Al-Malik is denoted firstly. From this, you have then, it denotes that God is Murabbi. Murabbi means like a caretaker, a nurturer, the one that looks after you. But there's a verse in the Quran where it's a prayer, and it says, وَقُلْ رَبِّ ارْحَمْهُمَا كَمَا رَبَّيَانِي صَغِيرًا. It's a prayer for your parents, where you're asking God, be merciful to them as they did nurture me when I was younger, like growing me, right? So that same notion of the way like good parents take care of their children, you know? Good parents look after their children, right? God, when you call upon him as Rabb, you're saying that he is Al-Malik and he is Murabbi. Does it make sense? it's also saying that he is Sayyid. So he's the one that is deciding how certain things take place, right? And these two things are important. They're not qualifying God as being Malik, but they exist in essence of who God is altogether. Do you see what I mean? So not only do you have a God who owns things and gives you what is in his possession, but it's a loving God, a nurturing God, a God that is helping to rear you and cultivate a relationship with you, right? The God that's in charge of stuff. It also denotes that God is mun'im. In Arabic, the word for blessing is ni'mah, right? A gift. So God is the giver of blessings. God is the giver of gifts. It denotes that God is qayyim. He's the one that's keeping everything kind of in its place, you know? Like, do you remember when we were talking about the establishment of prayer some weeks ago, right? We said, iqamat as-salah, right? That you're making the prayer stand up. Like, that's what it's, you're making the prayer straight, right? And I gave the example of, like, you walk through New York where there's just all these saplings of trees every block, and that the tree, when it's in a small kind of nascent stage, that there's a piece of wood usually tied to it that's keeping it upright, but it's making this tree upright, right? That's what iqamat as-salah means, like make the prayer upright, right? So God is qayyim, like it's got the same letters to it, right? He's the one that's keeping things like in their place, keeping things upright. Do you get what I mean? Right? That in this, I'll just write it in English, that God is the healer of all things. So the owner, the caretaker, the master, so to speak, the giver of gifts, of blessings, the one keeping things upright in their place, and the mender, the healer of all things. All of that is the definition of Rabb. And that's what they're trying to say Lord means. You understand? Do you see the difference? Right? Like, if I think of this, I'm picturing, like, if you've ever been to medieval times before, where, has anybody ever been to medieval times? Yeah? Yeah. So this, you get what I mean, right? It's kind of like people are, like, honoring their knight, and, you know, royalty is eating, and that's like a lord, but it's inaccessible. Do you get what I'm saying? It's like a stratification that is rooted in classism that denotes that I'm not in a place where I should even think of having a relationship with you. But that's not what this means. This is, if there's anything that I'm supposed to or should be a servant of, it should be of God, right? Who's my caretaker? Who's the giver of all these blessings, right? So it's not Lord in that way. Any questions on that? Any thoughts on that? So what I'd like you to do, just for 2 minutes, you turn to the person next to you, and if you don't know their names, share their names. What are you taking away from that so far? Just so we can kind of process it a little bit, and then we'll come back and discuss. Just for 2 minutes. Go ahead. Okay, so what are some of the things we're talking about? What are you taking away so far? Anything comes up interesting? So what happens for, yeah, go ahead.
We were just talking about how it's really beautiful how Rabb can be all these many different definitions, and that it can mean different things in like different seasons of your life. Or like how today I might need him to be my caretaker, and tomorrow I might need him to be like the person, or not the person, but the thing that's making me straight or keeping me straight. And it's just this, it's not just this stagnant one word like Lord, where you just think of it as like, okay, like that's the Lord, that's it. Like in the medieval times example that you gave, but it's really just this kind of this, it's ever changing, not ever changing, like it's still Rab, but it just can mean different things at different moments in time.
Yeah. Any other thoughts? And you want to think, right? There's nothing in Islamic theology, this is like a foundational principle. There's nothing without meaning in God's plan, right? So there's a reason why, like, Allah in the Quran introduces himself to the reader on literally the first page in this way, as opposed to introducing himself on the first page as the creator, as opposed to introducing in other ways, right? So it's that foundational relationship. If God is Rabb, that means I am Abd. We're going to see a verse in the middle of the chapter that you'll find quite often. If you were here, I talked about this maybe at Jummah last week or the week before, where like a key ingredient to the relationship between an Abd and Rabb is guidance, right? And that's a prayer that's going to be asked for by the one reciting this chapter in a later verse. It says, Ihdina sirat al-mustaqim, guide me to the straight path. And a lot of the times in the Quran, when you see this word Rabb, you'll see at some point, like in close proximity within that chapter, a mention of guidance, right? That if this is my Lord, who is all of these things, the way that I demonstrate my servitude in Islam to my Rabb is by like doing what he says to do, right? Not by not doing what he says to do. Do you get what I mean? Mm-hmm. You know, so if I go home, the way that I know that I am not the Lord of my children is because they don't do the things that I ask them to do. You know what I mean? Right? And I'm like literally, I have this conversation with my kids. I'm like, and they're super nice. Some of you are my children. They're beautiful, mashallah. But I'll be like, hey, can you do this? And they'll be like, wait a second, I'm going to do this first. And it's not even that they're doing something that's belligerent or like impolite, but it's just do the thing I asked you to do, man. Why are you doing these other things before that? Some of it doesn't even make any sense, you know? The relationship here is rooted in that. In Arabic, the word for guidance, huda, hidayah, the word for gift is hadiya. It has the same root letters, right? And that's the way that it is. Like you're given this as a gift. And all of it is there because that's how language works. You find meaning through words. And you can then create an entire sense of like the moment that I'm in just by knowing what does this word mean, right? By extension, what happens also is that this word abd is a baseline characteristic of everything in creation. So if you're not willfully choosing to be an abd of God, you're going to still be an abd of something, right? You can choose to be something that is subservient to, example, wealth, but then you're never going to be satisfied, right? You can choose to be subservient to like just your physical demeanor, what you look like, beauty, and you're going to die 1,000 times over as you get older and older, and you just keep looking at yourself in the mirror, right? My friends and my wife and I were hanging out this weekend, some friends we hadn't seen for some time, and someone took a picture of my wife giving me a kiss on the cheek, and the sun was hitting us in such a way where like I have a lot of gray hair in my beard, and it looks really, really white in this picture. And my friend says, whoa, Priya, it looks like you're kissing your grandfather. And I was like, oh, that's amazing. You can laugh, it's okay. You don't have to cover your face, right? If I was in a place where I was subservient to my physical demeanor only, it would get to a place where every time I looked in the mirror as my physical being aged, it would just destroy myself, right? And people manipulate our core belief structure, not abstract doctrine or theology, but the cognitive mechanisms through which how we process reality. I am beautiful. I am not beautiful. What the Quran is saying is that you're beautiful even when you're 60 or 70 years old. Your beauty lies in not becoming submissive to something that is going to inculcate a sense of deficiency within you in some capacity. But you should be subservient to a God that we're going to talk about in a little bit more, how he further introduces himself to you. But ultimately, everybody is going to be a worshiper of something, you know? So the Quran is saying, choose to be a worshiper of the one that's worthy of worship, right? That's why the Shahada says, La ilaha illallah, there's nothing worthy of worship except Allah. Then we add in the part alameen. And so the way, if you remember, we talked about Arabic being a language that is based off of a root letter system. So the word Muslim, Islam, Salam, it all has these letters. Salama, right? And you can see the link between the words. So, Alameen in Arabic has the letters that we'll get to in the next few weeks. Ain, Lam, Mim, right? It's a Al, Alama. This means like knowledge or knowing something, right? So the idea here is that this word can mean a lot of different things. Alameen can be in reference to, for example, everything that's not Rabb, right? Because Allah uniquely is the Rabb, so he's the Rabb of everything else, you know? So this is anything that's ever been created, you know, across galaxies and universes and worlds, etc. Alameen, because it's rooted in ilm, knowing, is also making a categorical difference, for example, between a world of knowing and a materialistic world, right? Which in Arabic is called the dunya, right? So your time on this world is not like shackled by things that are materialistic, things that are just externals, you know? But it's a world of knowing, so that when you walk down the street, you actually take a pause to say, look at how beautiful this flower is, right? Look at how gentle, like, the mother bird treats its baby chicks. You know, look at how sweet the sound of a child's laughter is. Do you get what I mean? But you're taking steps of knowing in a world of knowing. You know, you're not taking steps of forgetfulness, right? There's steps that increase you in an opportunity of finding depth of perspective. So some people would say this word alameen refers to like everything that's ever been created. Some people would say that he's the Lord of it, also meaning like the knowing worlds, or like those that have the capacity to know in the world, meaning like all humanity, right? What this is denoting fundamentally is also a linkage between all people. It's not a theology that denotes like selected individuals having a relationship with God, but people in all of their racial diversity, their cultural diversity, their socioeconomic diversity, everything falls into this connection. And that we don't exist in a sphere that seeks to pursue independence as like a goal, but interdependence as a goal. How do we lean on each other? How do we exist within one another, right? That we're all connected in a God-centric paradigm that isn't despite, but embrace of our diversity. Do you know what I mean? So it's giving an indication to a deep sanctity of humanity, and something that is not to knock other religions, but it doesn't exist in other religions in the same way, right? So all of that is being kind of denoted when we're saying Rabbil Alameen. Does that make sense? This is the first verse of the chapter that you're going to recite in your prayer. Yeah? Has anybody memorized this already? Yeah. And how is it, like, for those of you who are working on it so far? Oh, okay. Yeah.
Sometimes I don't know which words are silent and which words aren't.
Which words are silent?
Which letters are silent and which ones.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. And how are you going about it?
Well, I just use the Adlin app.
Yeah.
And then it gives you like the word as it's like. So there's like a bunch of A's and a bunch of E's, a bunch of I's. I'm like,
Yeah.
which one do I enunciate more than the other?
Yeah. Go ahead, Kara.
So something that helped me memorize it, I'm a very visual person, I need to write it down over and over. What I did was, I listened to it, I printed out like a copy of like what it said online, like how it's written over here. And then I listened to it and I took out whatever letters didn't make sense to me. Whatever I didn't hear, I took it out because at the end of the day, I'm the one like looking at it and trying to memorize it. So maybe that can help you, just like write it out and get rid of the letters you don't hear. And then over time, it'll just like, in your head, you'll probably see what you wrote down over and over again. So you can try that.
Yeah, and it's a transliteration, right? So you're transliterating based off of where you're at as we're learning the letters to the alphabet and getting comfortable then, like a month and a half from now, to reading like more kind of fluidly, you know? But that's a great like idea. So as you listen to it, you kind of take out what the transliterated letters are. And so here, like we'll say it all together, right? So if you want to repeat after me, Alhamdu Lillahi Rabbil Alameen. Yeah. How is that for people? Go ahead.
Sorry, this is gonna be a very annoying question. Do people have to sing when they are reading the Quran?
No. So what you're calling singing is just like different aspects to the recitation. And we'll get into it more in detail, but there's an actual like science to the recitation. And what happens when people are learning how to read the Quran, they first go through every letter and its pronunciation. So remember last week we did 4 letters, right? Or 2 weeks ago, right? We didn't meet last week because the world was on fire, right? So how we did alif, ba, ta, and tha, right? So we did a, I, u, ba, bi, bu, ta, ti, tu, and then tha we said was like theta, right? In English, right? So tha, thi, thu. What happens is there's some letters that have cognates, like in English, and some won't. Like ayn in alameen, that letter doesn't exist in English, you know? When we get to it, we'll talk about where, like, you pronounce it from, you know? What parts of your mouth, your throat, etc. Do you know what I mean? And it's going to be daunting because it's a totally brand new language, do you know? And that's why it's beautiful the way Islam is structured, because it's not requiring you as a new Muslim to somehow already have downloaded everything into your head and be able to recite it in a certain way from day one, right? Because if God doesn't understand who you are, then who is going to understand who you are? And if the system creates like a gap that you can't fit into, then that's like showing a lack of understanding between God and his creation. Do you get what I'm saying? Does that make sense? Yeah, so you just want to go at it at a pace that makes sense, right? And so as you're reciting it, like this is what you're saying. And it's giving an introduction as to who the divine is. And now in the next verse, what's going to happen is the next verse is going to give a deeper qualification to who is this Lord of the worlds, right? So it's going to say Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim and when you're reciting this, right, what it's going to be is Ar-Rahmanir Rahim, right? We'll talk about that in a few minutes. But these are 2 divine names of God. So the notion is that if you were to take all of the water of bodies of water in the world and all of the trees in the world, and the trees, you know, were turned to pens and the water was turned to ink, you would exhaust them and still not recite or write down all of the divine names of God, like the way you could qualify God. But there's certain ways that Allah has introduced himself to us through the Quran, and pondering and reflecting upon these words are where we can draw some insight. The theology of God in Islam is a negative knowledge, right? Not a cynical or pessimistic knowledge, but it's a negative knowledge, meaning that the assumption is we don't have full capacity to fathom the divine in his true essence. And so we know who Allah is by knowing what he is not, and where we have opportunity to have a baseline understanding in our own limited capacity. It's different essentially from other monotheistic traditions. But in this chapter that you're reciting every day, God is saying, this is who you should know me to be, right, as an introduction. The word Rahman and Rahim, how does it get translated in your translations? Yeah.
The Lord of mercy, giver of mercy.
Yeah, right? So when you think about mercy, especially in like inequitous society, supremacist society, capitalistic society, mercy quite often goes hand in hand with justice, punishment, right? You cross a red light, you get a ticket. Did you want to say something? You have your hand raised? No. Yeah. So rahma, the root of these two letters, of these two words, has these same letters, rahama, and they denote like this idea of mercy, compassion. The word for womb in Arabic, for example, is rahim. It's got the same letters, right? And it gives a great illustration, like the womb, expands to accommodate life, So mercy, compassion is meant to be expansive, not restrictive, right? It's meant to kind of grow with the person's need, not meant to kind of collapse and suffocate it. Do you get what I'm saying? Right? Rahma in Arabic is not just mercy, but rahma has its own unique element of gentleness, softness, kindness, love, as well as mercy. All of this goes into that word rahma. And you want to break it down, because if we said just mercy, we'd be thinking about it unconsciously in the way we think about mercy, right? Have mercy upon me. This is what like the prisoner says to the judge at a sentencing. Do you know? That's not the relationship that like Allah is telling you to have with who he is. Rahman in Arabic is something that denotes a few different things. And it functions off of like a form in Arabic. That's the way Arabic words are built. Does anybody here speak any Arabic? Or has any like Arabic speaking people in their lives? Yeah. Yeah. So like if I told you, for example, hey, like when the class is done, put all the stuff away, and you didn't do it, and I'd be like, you are so lazy, You're so lazy. Laziness is you, right? It's the defining quality of you right now. Emphatic. I'd say you are kaslan. Do you hear how it has like a similar sound to it as Rahman? Kaslan. If I was exhausted, I'm sitting here and I'm like passing out in the chair, falling asleep, and I'm just so exhausted, so tired, I'd say I'm ta'ban, right? The tiredness is me. Exhaustion is me. If you hadn't eaten anything all day, right? I've been eating gross food all day. It's kind of a norm to the stories that I tell people. I woke up this morning, I don't even know why. I was like half asleep, and I went to the kitchen. My kids had like, I don't know what kind of cereals in the closet, from like Reese's peanut butter cups to Cocoa Puffs. We don't usually buy them these things, but on occasion. We're like sometimes really strange parents, right? My kids on their birthday, we might get them a box of Fruit Loops. That's how terrible we are to them. Like, oh, it's your birthday. Here, eat some Fruit Loops. Congratulations. And then we had Trader Joe's cereal. I was eating all three of these things. I don't know why. It was a bad idea. And then 2 hours later, I was like, oh, I'm going to have a long day. should probably eat something. As my wife always says, you don't remember to eat. So I ate some pasta and chicken, and then I came here, and there's a box of donuts in our office. And Khalid was like, I'm going to eat these donuts. And I was like, I'm not going to eat them. And then 5 minutes later, I was eating them also. And I ate a glazed donut from Monday that's been sitting in our office from Dunkin' Donuts. It was super gross. I took a bite out of it, and it was gross. And I still ate the whole thing. And now I feel pretty terrible. Say I did not eat all of those things, and I hadn't eaten anything all day, and I hadn't eaten anything maybe like for a couple of days. And hunger was just like so apparent in me. The way that it would be described is Jo'an, right? That I'm so hungry. Hunger is like the emphatic quality of me in this moment. In all those descriptions, laziness, exhaustion, hunger, they have the ability to be remedied, to go away, right? I can eat something, hunger ends, right? I can sleep, exhaustion ends, right? I can pick up my stuff, laziness ends. So Rahman is saying it's now, it's emphasized, and it has the potential of like having a stop to it, right? Rahim has the same root, and it's going to still be these words in translations. The beneficent, the benevolent. It's like, who uses these words when we talk in regular everyday English? Rahim denotes continuity. It's like happening always. There's no stoppage to it. Does that make sense? It's something that has the capacity for forever. And so the way these two get linked, one, in description of this. You don't want to see the verses as separate sentences in a vacuum, but it's saying, all praise is for God, the Lord of the worlds. Well, what kind of Lord is he? He is a Rahman and a Rahim Lord. That he is super merciful, compassionate, loving, kind, gentle. It's what's the prevailing quality right now, and it is continuous. It happens forever. Does that make sense? And when you think about this now in like a servitude-based mode of a relationship, most people who lord over people, they're not nice to them, right? They don't treat them well. There's not that element of love to it. But here, Allah is saying, this is the kind of Rabb that I am, that you should know. I am a loving God. I am a merciful God. I am a gentle God. I am a kind God. I am a soft God. Does that make sense? Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim. And that's how God is introducing himself. Again, it's a qualification to this, and that's what you're invoking him by. Right? It's a conversation with the divine, the first chapter, Surah Fatiha. And then the third verse, where we'll stop today, says, Maliki Yom Ad-Din. So we already saw this word in the definition of Rabb, that Malik is the owner, Yom Ad-Din is the day of judgment, right? In Islamic theology, there's a recognition that you go through numerous realms of existence. And from this world, there's a life in an intermediary realm, a grave. Then there's a concept of a day of judgment, that everyone is essentially raised from their graves and taken into an individual account. And God is the owner of the day of judgment, right? God is the one that is the master of the day of judgment. And what this is giving now is like an essential understanding that if you know these things about God in Islam and you didn't know anything else, then this should suffice you in your relationship with God. That God is Rabb, so you are Abd. And He is Rabb of everything. That He is Rahman and Rahim, merciful and compassionate, and that He is the owner of the Day of Judgment, that you're going to stand in front of that God one day. And accountability is a big part of this religion, that you have a recognition then that you have a return to that God, and you'll stand with your decisions, your choices, etc. Does that make sense? So what I'd like for us to do is to try between this week and next week. This is like the first half of the chapter, and it's got a handful of words. So you want to try to memorize these 3 verses as best as you can. It's okay to work with a transliteration. And what you'll notice, if you listen to it enough, it has this kind of melodic element to it. Don't get lost in that. Do you know what I mean? When you learn to recite it in your own voice, with the rules, like it's just going to come on its own, but it's purposely constructed in a way where it's recitation. If you are engaging it enough, it's going to just stay in your head. You're going to see yourself going down the street, and you're just going to be like reciting it to yourself and these kinds of things. But spend some time with it. If you could do more than the first 3, that's fine. But do these 3 and spend some time, just recite them like 5 times, 10 times, then take a break at the beginning of the day, the end of the night, the next day, right? And you'll see it'll just start sticking with you, Yeah.
I have a question. If Allah is Ar-Rahman and Ar-Rahim, and then on the day of Yawm al-Qiyamah, what's the significance of it then, if He's always going to forgive you?
Today,
Why should we fear?
well, this word isn't about forgiveness alone, right? It's about other things. So the Day of Judgment is like a theological concept that also provides us the opportunity for questions of why to be answered. Like, why did certain things go the ways that they went in this world, right? It's a day of like balance. So we're taught that the goat that has horns will have recompense against it by the goat that had no horns, right? If there's anything that kind of was iniquitous, oppressive, usurpment, but all of these questions of why and balance will be restored. Like there'll be restitution, do you know? Does that make sense? Right? And it's yielding to this idea that God alone is like the Lord of all things. So the wisdom of God, the knowledge of God is one that far surpasses anything that we might be able to understand on a human level. And this is where there's no anthropomorphizing of God in Islamic theology, right? So there's no human understanding of the divine, right? Or God existing at a human level, or there being multiple gods. And again, it's not to knock someone's belief, right? But when you're talking about kind of absolutes in knowing everything, or like understanding everything, right? At these levels that exist beyond our realm of experience with time and reality, etc. How could it work if there was 2 beings that had that capacity? Do you know? How would it work if there was 5 beings that had that capacity? Do you get what I mean? And so in thinking about that in relation to other aspects, right? How could a God be those things and also die or sleep or eat? Do you see? So the theology has elements of reflection and contemplation that even through your own kind of rational mode of thinking, it has necessary questions that have to be answered. Do you know? How God will judge on a day of judgment is like on God's volition. The theology of Islam is not built off of an idea that just because you're Muslim, you guarantee yourself entrance into heaven. And if someone is not Muslim, that they're guaranteed a destination in hell, right? That's like a very Protestant theology in some denominations of theology. Again, it's not to knock anybody's belief, but it's not a Muslim theology, right? Yeah.
If someone were to memorize both the Arabic and the English translation, could they technically pray everything in English? Can they recite all 5 prayers in English?
In the prayer?
Yeah.
The prayer would have to be done in the Arabic.
It has to be done in
Yeah,
Arabic.
that's why we want to learn the Arabic. But that's where also, like that first bucket that we talked about that you weren't here for, we're going to go through it in like a week or two, that the minimum that you need is not this. This is like beyond the minimum. The minimum is just reciting any like short verse of the Quran in the Hanafi school.
I guess I have a bigger question of why does prayer have to be said in Arabic?
Because the Quran itself is in Arabic, but the translation of the Quran is not considered to be Quran. It's considered to be a translation of the Quran. Yeah? Yeah. Okay. So why don't we do this just in the last 10 minutes that we have? Did anybody actually try to mess around with the letters that we talked about last time? The alif, ba, ta, tha? You did? How'd that go for you?
It looks like chicken scratch.
Nice. Did you find any of them in the chapter? Did anybody do that? So one person tried it and no one looked up the
I got
letters.
a book.
You got a book?
I'm gonna write it.
Yeah?
Did me a book.
Oh, look at you.
$5.
Yeah. So I ordered a book that's going to come in tomorrow that I'll make photocopies of also, but it's great that you have this. You want to get into the habit of doing it and practicing it. Otherwise, it's not going to work, right? And it might seem like it's a daunting task, but it literally will just take like moments. And as you learn the alphabet and how the letters connect, it'll open up a lot of different things, because then we'll have the ability to have you start like reading from the text, right? And then you work on like the fluidity of it. You can learn like kind of meanings of words and have conversations and these kinds of things. Do you know? Yeah.
Can I make a suggestion?
Sure.
So when I first started learning the alphabet, I got a whiteboard at home, and I just wrote it over and over again. And it also helps with learning like the alliteration, like we were talking about. Just writing it over and over again, so you can easily like erase it. It helps with the English as well. Because I started off in a notebook, and then I realized how annoying that was to like use up all those pages. So I just got a whiteboard.
Yeah, and that's how like people actually study Quran in some parts of the world. If you go to Mauritania, they're really big on memorization. That isn't just about memorizing the words, but memorizing it to the extent that you can actually write it too. And they write on clay tablets, and as they learn the lesson, they write it out, and then they just erase the clay and write on the same tablet again. Do you know? So I'm not saying this as a problematic way, but since nobody did what they were supposed to do, then let's do that from this week to next week. Those first 4 letters that we looked at, right? We had alif, we had ba, we had ta, and we had tha. And as we learn more letters, you're going to see why they connect in the ways that they connect. Because essentially within the letters, you'll find the other letters also, right? Their shapes and how they're drawn and why they connect from one end and not the other, so that there's distinction between them, right? So what I'd like you to do is we went through the beginning, middle, and end of the letters, right? So connect them in groups of 3, right? So, put aleph first, ba, and ta. What does that look like, right? Mix them up a bit, ta, aleph, ba, right? Put the 3 that look similar together in words. They're nonsense words, right? Some of them might be a word. So ba, aleph, ba is bab, and it means door, for example, right? But like most of the words are not going to mean anything. Do you know? Just so you're getting a familiarity with it. And then open the Quran, the Arabic. You could do it on the computer. You could like do it in the actual mushaf, the actual text. But just look for the letters in Surah Fatiha, right? So you can start identifying them, You don't have to do anything. You don't have to highlight it, circle it, but just look, right? Like Alhamdulillah, there are a lot of alifs in that, right? Rabbil Alameen, it has the ba in it. Do you see? Does that make sense? Right? Malik has an alif in it, And you can start noticing them in the text, so it'll start helping to kind of bridge some of that gap, right? Okay, so we'll see everyone next Wednesday. inshallah. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.
We hope you enjoyed our podcast. If you're inspired by the work that we're doing at the IC and want to help keep it going, subscribe to our podcasts, follow us on social media, donate to help support us at ICNYU.org, and most importantly, keep us in your continued du'as. Until next time, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.